Well, very good afternoon to all of you, and I want to thank Seng and the SBF for inviting me to join you. This morning, I was at a UBS conference talking about wealth management, and before I entered the room, someone said, "Minister, the audience is looking to hear your insights about the market." So I said, well, I have no insights about the market, because if I do, then I will be a Warren Buffett or at least a UBS wealth manager. So better wait for your UBS wealth manager. So in the same way, I'm delighted to be in a room full of very eminent business leaders and people who care a lot about the Singapore economy. And I will not be able to offer you great business insight. In fact, it will be the other way around, and I look forward to hearing your insights. But first, let me say that I'm really delighted that the SBF has come together to put up this position paper. And in fact, it did it ahead of government, before we even formed the Committee on the Future Economy. I think a full 6 months ahead? Just by chance. Just by chance. Even better. Even better. And so thanks for presenting this to me formally, but I've actually read it since and I've read the details of what you have put out. Having read it, I said, well, this is a very good set of recommendations. Maybe I should ask something not only to be on the Committee of the Future Economy, but to co-chair with me the subcommittee on how we develop corporate capabilities and innovation. So I want to thank Seng for doing that, and to all of you for your support to the SBF, and of course to what we can do together. Now, so I will say a few words about where we are in the economy today, and what might be the way forward. I think today we are at a very important point in our economic development. We have a set of cyclical forces on the global economy and a set of structural forces, which is making the situation rather complex and challenging. And on a cyclical basis, after the global financial crisis, many economies, be it the US or China, went through a period of very expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. And in the case of China, the very expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, I think, has run its course. And what has come out of that is a build-up of debt, overcapacity, and we are now at a stage where China is trying to work out, how do you overcome all this overcapacity, what do you need to do, and how do you overcome the build-up of debt. And on the other side, you have the US, which has taken very decisive action in some of its sectors, including the financial sector, to clean up the banks, to recapitalize, to put it on the stronger footing. So the US economy is recovering. In fact, I recall at the height of the crisis, the exchange rate between US and Singapore was staying 1.24. 1.24, at some point even 1.21. I think some of you remember that. And now the US has appreciated against practically every currency in the world, including the yuan, the RMB. So you see how within a period of just a few years, you have very significant changes, both on a cyclical basis, but also on a structural basis. And we did the ESC only back in 2010, and now we are looking at another round of economic review. So the question is, why are we doing that? And that brings me to my second point, which is really the structural changes which are happening in the global economy. These are very significant changes that are happening in China, in Japan, in the US, in Europe. There are some broad forces at work, demographic changes across the world, technology, digitization, and so on and so forth. So I think, as your paper pointed out, there are many important driving forces that are happening in the global economy. In Singapore, we are also faced with very important structural factors that we have to contend with. One of this is really about demographics. So yesterday, at our first meeting on the Committee on the Future Economy, we touched quite a bit on the impact of demographics on our economy. First, just sheer quantity of labor that we have. When I was in MOE, one of the hard jobs I had to do was to close primary schools. Because we used to have in the 60s about 60 over 1,000 students per year in primary one, right, enrolling every year. Last few years, I had about less than 40,000. So it's a significant reduction. We had to close primary schools. So if you close primary school, the logical thing to do next step is close secondary schools. And indeed, my successor is closing secondary school or merging secondary schools. So it's not a positive trend for us. And we have to, that's why this whole thing about marriage and parenthood and increasing fertility in Singapore is such an important part of our agenda. And the other aspect of it is that demographics also have important implications on our dependency ratio, on the profile of our workforce. So at one end, we have workers who are in their 50s, many like in my generation, who actually didn't even get to pass the PSLE. In fact, half of my classmates didn't pass PSLE. And so they are all roughly about my age and in my school. And it is not easy. I've met some of them. I mean, they are trying to adjust to these changes in the economy, not just in Singapore, but these are all global forces. And you have on the other side a much younger profile. The millennials that are coming out of school today, they have very different aspirations, different expectations, and a very different skill sets. And our challenge is that unlike companies, as a country, you have to take care of everyone in the society, create opportunities for all Singaporeans, regardless of their age or their background, and try and raise the skills level as much as possible of everyone. So those are the sort of major structural changes. One is demographics. Two is, of course, how do we maximize the land that we have in Singapore, and how do we build that capability to organize things. So for that reason, we have structured the Committee on the Future Economy on a number of broad themes, which I'll touch on later, which is very close to what you have. So let me say a few words now about your recommendations. When I read the report, I was really quite delighted for a number of reasons. First and foremost is the fact that businesses are coming together to lead this effort, to think about what we need to do, because you care about your businesses, you care about your industry, you care about the Singapore economy. So I really want to commend all of you for this effort, and SBF for taking the lead in this. The other thing that gave me a lot of cheer is your recommendations. When I went through it, I said, oh, that's very interesting, because you have strategy, right? Short-term for the immediate term. So you have a number of recommendations, actually two major ones on the immediate ones, or three. Then on the bulk of your recommendations are really about medium to long-term strategies, what we need to do in the medium to long term. And I was very cheered by that because, as businesses, you are under short-term pressure all the time. Those of you who are listed, you have quarterly reporting to take care of, right? And as they said, you cannot always be thinking of the long term if you cannot survive the short term, right? So I think it is quite remarkable that your recommendations touch a lot on the medium to long term and what we need to do. And this is exactly what the Committee on the Future Economy seeks to do, which is how do we reposition our Singapore economy for the medium to long term. And I would say that a number of your recommendations are very much in line with some of my initial thoughts about the key things we need to do. So let me just highlight a couple of them. One is really for the medium term, which is how do you develop Singapore as a create an economy that's not constrained by our geographical boundaries. And yesterday, when I spoke about this, I said, well, basically, we need to really think about internationalization, right? To overcome the constraints of our small market, to make the best use of our small markets, and to make the best use of our position in this time zone, and given our history of being a part of a global environment and an Asian environment. So in the last ESC, we talked about Singapore being a global Asia node, and I think since then, as I mentioned to the audience this morning, I'm not pessimistic about the Asian growth, because if you look at all the projections, it is not as buoyant as we had historically, but the consensus forecast is a growth of about 6% between 2015 to 2020. So you are looking at a growth rate in Asia that is significantly above the global average. And as an emerging region, I think there's still a lot that this region can grow. So your first strategy about internationalization, is something that we certainly have to do. And then your second strategy about developing Singapore as a strong home base for innovation, for growth, and I fully endorse that. It is not just about companies going international, but if companies go international, how does Singapore serve our companies? And we really have to think hard about how we can be a competitive home base and an innovative home base for our companies. And then you have very specific recommendations in each of these areas about developing local enterprises and all that, and many thoughtful ideas and recommendations. So we'll study that very carefully, both in the committee as well as by the different government agencies. I think these are thoughtful recommendations, and therefore it requires the same thoughtful deliberations and further discussions on these topics. Now, let me just pick up on one of the points. I would say that I agree with quite a lot of the details in what you said. For instance, I think there was a quote by Manu about how do we understand SMEs a lot better, that the term SME is really a little too broad, and how do we find a meaningful way of looking at different types of SMEs and what they need to do. So I would endorse that and say we should do a lot more work to look at this. There are very thoughtful recommendations about how we can be more innovative and how we can build talent, how we can grow our people. And those are things which we are going to do in the Skills Future, so I welcome your inputs. Now, I just want to pick up on one point in one of your recommendations, which is that we got to, if you look at Skills Future, it is not just about skills, but it's really about values, about attitudes. And I would fully endorse that, and I would extend that even further. I've gone to every social function ever since I became Education Minister, and there has never been one function where the problem didn't go back to education. So this time round, there is even an official report that says the problem is in education. So I'm glad that when you talk about values, that will happen to be the first topic I spoke about as Education Minister. So it's something that I can fully resonate with and fully endorse. But I'd like to kind of take it a little further, which is, you also mentioned about building the entrepreneurial spirit in our schools and so on. I agree with that, except for one point, which is I think we should start even earlier. Because you see, if you look at our schools, by the time the kids come out to join the economy, you'll be 20 years from now. So why do we want to lose 20 years? I think the task of building an entrepreneurial spirit should start now. In every, we should carry on our efforts. And I think Fook Kwang had an interesting article in the ST 2 days ago about this point. So I would say that spirit is going to be very important. So I would say that when you look at this series of documents, it reminds me of what we did in SG50. See, in SG50, my biggest takeaway of the significance of SG50 is that it allows us to build a certain Singapore spirit. And it's a Singapore spirit where, you look at the sense, the resilience of our people, the sense of responsibility, and the resourcefulness of our people over the last 50 years. And in particular, the tone set by our pioneer generation, which allowed us to really make progress against the odds. And I think we overcome a lot more challenges and difficulties than what most people would have expected us to. And in the same way, when we think about the next 50 years, we need to keep that Singapore spirit. And in the case of in the business context, I'll say that there are three particular qualities that I hope that we can develop. First is this entrepreneurial spirit that we spoke about. That this willingness and ability to see opportunities, to make the best out of adverse circumstances, to turn constraints into advantages. And this is what we have done over the last 50 years. Water is a problem, we turn the water problem into an exportable industry. Land is a constraint, but we can be a model of how we build this city. The urban redevelopment and all that has done a good job, and I think our property developers in Singapore, our industrial land developers have done a very good job of optimizing this. And I was looking at the data on our land intensity per unit of output. Wow. I don't know whether it means that I'm getting red marks for this or whether it's an endorsement and that we can now go party. Yeah. So, on our land intensity of output, it has come down very significantly over the last 20 years. And it shows that our businesses are adapting. Yes, land cost is an issue, but we are adapting and we are making better use of land than we ever do. And the question is now, with the technological trends, with digitization, how do we make even better use of our land? So I see great scope for us to think about doing that. I recently was in New York City looking at, a city is always limited, right? I mean, even a city like New York, you cannot expand indefinitely. So how do you make the best use of the CBD area in New York City? And how do the retail establishments in New York adjust to this higher cost? So I met up with this Google Sidewalk Cafe, the CEO in charge of it. He used to run Bloomberg business. And the Google Sidewalk Cafe is now turning the 10,000 telephone boxes, which are stranded assets now. Nobody going to use a public telephone for the mobile. They happen to be stranded assets from old economy's point of view. From digital economy's point of view, these are hugely valuable assets because the telephone booths are right in the heart of every neighborhood and right in the heart of the city center. So what do you do with stranded assets like that? Well, turn them into wireless hotspots, high-speed network, driven by Google and this consortium. The government basically say, well, I'll let you use this, and I'm going to extract something out of this deal. And what do they do with it? Well, they are trying to combine the digital and the physical. That everyone has a mobile phone now, and you have all the stores in this area. If I can maximize the footprint of all this, if everybody who passes through one of these can get into my shop in some ways, the per store sales will go up significantly. I was talking to one of our designers who is building this, what they call now a brand temple. So I said, what is a brand temple? He said, well, now with e-commerce, people don't really adjust. A lot of transactions are now taking place through e-commerce. People just buy online. But if you're buying fashion and all that, you do want to touch and feel what it is. And so what do you do with it? Well, you need a place for people to go, but it shouldn't be any place. It should be a place where somebody comes and say, wow, this is the best product that I need to buy. And so some of the leading stores are now getting designers to design these brand temples so that consumers go to those places, create an image of what it is, and then you shop online and they deliver in many different ways. So I shared this story with one of our startups here, and they were doing something that was even more interesting than that in Singapore. So I was really quite delighted that some of these changes are taking place. So my point here is that when you look at all these changes that are taking place, whether it's in New York City trying to maximize land use and all that, those are constraints, but I think with the entrepreneurial spirit, you can turn those constraints into opportunities. And it'll be very interesting to see how this pan out in New York City. So I think on one major area is really this entrepreneurial spirit, and closely related is we need to inculcate this innovative spirit and make it pervasive across the economy. We have a lot of knowledge assets in our economy. What we need to do is to really understand business needs a lot better and turn these knowledge assets into products and services. And finally, which is in different parts of your recommendation, is about this collaborative spirit. I think SBF has done a good job getting the chambers to come together. One of your recommendations is about PACT and LEAD and all these different schemes. And I'll say that, again, one challenge that businesses face in Singapore is the economies of scale. And we basically need to scale. And the question is, how do we develop that scale that will lower the unit cost for everybody? And how do businesses work more closely together and work more closely with government to develop that scale? And this is going to be an ongoing journey. I just share one last story in my days in the Trade Development Board. When I was at the TDB, I wanted very much businesses to create a Singapore brand. So once we had this major exhibition in Europe, and there was a group of our business leaders who were going there to for an exhibition to exhibit their product. So I said, oh, 6 of you are all going there. How big is your stand? And each one of them, because of the cost, took a small little stand. So I said, why don't you all put it together, and TDB, in those days we called TDB, we'll be happy to work together with you to market Singapore better, and call it Singapore, stuff, and then people will know Singapore stuff. But they came back to me and said, so my staff worked very hard trying to get them to do this, and they came back to say, no, we are all competitors. How can we do that? And so I was quite disappointed. So I said, let's try again. So I thought, maybe these things government should do, so we should go and do it. Then 2 years later, I followed. At that time, when I became PERMSEC MTI, I went to Wenzhou, followed Raymond Lim, who was then co-chairing the Singapore Jiangsu Business Council. And then in Wenzhou, they took us. Wenzhou at that point had about 70% of the world's cigarette lighters market. So we went there and they took us to this beautiful showroom. It's about the size of this hall. And every possible brand of cigarette lighter, every possible model was there. So I said, wow, your equivalent of TDB has done a very good job. Can I learn how to do this? Then I'll do it in Singapore. Then he turned to me and said, Mr. Heng, no. 我们自己做的. We did it ourselves. So I said, you mean you are manufacturers, you all came together? He said, of course. So why do we want to need to do that? We just come and do it together. I said, why do you do it that way? He said, well, think about it. We want Wenzhou to be the place for doing this business. And if your buyers have to go to 10 different shops in order to find the 10 different models, they are going to find it very inefficient, and it's not going to do a lot of good. I said, but aren't you competing? He said, yeah, but if we can increase our overall market share, every one of us benefits. And that competition keeps us sharp. So there are some things that we should compete on, like the quality of our work, quality of our design. There are some things we should not compete on. So I said, oh, that's very interesting. It was done completely on their own. So I left feeling a little impressed until I went to the next stop. And this was a place that was making machines for little screws. And cigarette lighters, I learned, had lots of small little parts, So this little SME fella has a machine. And I say, oh, it's a costly machine. How many pieces you produce? He said, oh, very, very cheap. I produce 1 million pieces. I say, you produce 1 million pieces, who are your buyers? They say, well, all the cigarette lighter makers in Wenzhou. So I say, you make only one part and everyone else uses your part? He said, yes. I said, that's how I drive economies of scale. So I was quite intrigued by that set of numbers. So I went back to the main people who were briefing me. I said, tell me your cost structure. They said, well, actually, in our competitor country, which is an advanced country, the cost is about $10, 10 US in those days. Here in Wenzhou, we do it at $1, a factor, of 10. We do it in $1. I said, how do you do that? He said, well, Mr. Heng, you saw what the factory did. One machine produces for all manufacturers, deep specialization, Adam Smith. Economies of scale driven across the whole industry. One showroom, all of us do it, and buyers come. We compete, we keep each other sharp, we continue to innovate on design. And you saw the variety of design. He said, I did. And that was when I was PermSec MTI, which meant that was 2003 or 2004. So more than 10, 12 years ago. So I do hope that we build this collaborative spirit in looking at how we can keep Singapore as a competitive home base, as an innovative home base for all our businesses. And that requires deep interaction amongst our companies, whether both large and small, local and foreign. And I think if we can encourage that deep linkages, I think we can make this place a competitive home base. And so that's, by the way, that's one of the pieces of work that Song Seng and I will have to do. Is that how do we build in the first place, corporate capabilities and innovative capabilities in our companies, and how do we encourage the entire system to have the condition to allow us to do that. So while we have looked at specific recommendations, I think the spirit behind those is just as important. The entrepreneurial spirit, the innovative spirit, and the collaborative spirit. And there's much work to be done ahead. I look forward to your views and recommendations. We'll study the recommendations of SBF very carefully, deliberate on that, both in the CFE as well as in our government agencies. And then we can see what we can do together. I'm sure there's a lot we can do together.